On the glittering throne world of the Zelkari Dominion, beneath skies painted in violet storms and golden lightning, Queen Zelaria the Unyielding stood in the grand hall of talons. Her insectoid body towered above her council, wings folded. Neatly behind her crystalline armor, eyes glowing with ruthless determination. The Magor hive had moved again, devouring colonies, corrupting planets, leaving silence where once there had been life. The Queen's voice echoed like thunder, commanding her most trusted general, Varel, to gather an army vast enough to crush their ancient enemy once and for all. Across the stars, thousands of Zelkari legions stirred, conquered species, enslaved. Soldiers and machine battalions were all summoned to the cause. But weeks passed, and the court grew restless. Finally, the high doors of the palace opened, and General Varel entered. Not with columns of troops behind him, but walking alone, followed by a single, ragged figure. He was not tall by Zelkari standards, but there was something unnerving about him. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes scanned the hall like a hunter sizing up prey. The alien nobles hissed and clicked in confusion. "Where is the army?" the Queen demanded. The general stepped aside, and the human took one step forward, his voice calm, almost casual. "Name's Jack Reeve," he said, meeting the Queen's gaze without fear. "He is the army," Varel declared, silencing the chamber. Outrage rippled through the court. How could a single creature, small and flesh-bound, be the answer to their Queen's command? But Varel stood firm. He explained what he had seen on the shattered world of Ravex 9, where this human had held off an entire battalion of Magor for 3 days without support. How Jack used guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and sheer stubbornness to survive. "He doesn't fight like we do," Varel said, his voice low. "But where he walks, enemies fall. He wins, even when logic says he shouldn't." The Queen's many eyes narrowed. She studied the human not as a subject, but as a question. One that could change the fate of empires. The hall fell silent until Jack, with a half-smile, looked up at the towering Queen and said, "You want an army? I'll teach you how to win without one." A murmur moved through the court, a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The Queen raised a claw, silencing them all, then spoke a single word. "Prove it." And just like that, the tides of the Dominion began to shift. Not with the march of millions, but with the quiet footsteps of one human who had come to change everything. Deep within the towering spires of the Zelkari military command, where walls pulsed with biolight and warriors moved. Like clockwork gears in a hive of precision, Jack Reeve felt like an error in the system. The inner sanctum was a place of silence and order, where no one questioned commands, and where unity was valued above thought. Here, ranks were not just labels, they were laws. The Zelkari generals, massive insectoid beings of steel hard, chitin and telepathic discipline, studied Jack like he was some wild animal accidentally let loose in a laboratory. From the moment he arrived, everything he did rubbed them the wrong way. He asked questions that made no sense to them, like, "Why are you doing it this way?" Or, "Who says we can't change the plan?" He laughed during briefings, ate during meetings, and once threw a training manual into a fire just to prove a point. But when it came to results, even his worst critics were forced to watch. In the simulations, Jack was chaos unleashed. Where the Zelkari followed rigid formations and textbook strategy, Jack used confusion, ambush, misdirection. In one training exercise, while the elite Black Carapace Legion advanced in perfect lines against a mock enemy force, Jack vanished, with a small squad circled behind both enemy and ally, and eliminated every command unit on the field in under 15 minutes. The generals were stunned. The simulation had never been won that way before, not in thousands of trials. Jack simply shrugged and said, "You lot fight like statues. Statues are easy to tip over." Some called it disrespect. Others called it genius. Either way, his presence was turning the entire command center upside down. Soldiers began whispering about the human trickster. Young recruits copied. his lopsided thinking. Even senior strategists started analyzing his battle logs, though they never admitted it openly. The more the Zelkari tried to understand his methods, the more unpredictable Jack became. He trained alone in strange patterns, built traps in unused corridors, and once faked an emergency just to test how quickly security would respond. When questioned, he simply replied, "You never know when the real thing will hit." But it wasn't until the Grand War Game that his legend truly began. This was an annual event where the best minds of the Dominion tested their might in a massive, full-scale simulation designed to mimic real war. It was tradition, formal, controlled. Jack, however, didn't play by the rules. He was given a mock battalion to command and immediately split it into scattered cells. He gave strange orders: build fake camps, use recordings of enemy voices, leave false tracks, hack the simulation code itself. Within hours, the opposing side was chasing ghosts. Within a day, the entire field was in disarray. Jack even turned allied units against each other by planting forged orders. When it ended, there were no victors standing, only confusion. But the Queen had been watching. High above the chaos, from her private observation chamber, Queen Zelaria studied the human with growing fascination. He didn't think in lines. He thought in webs. His mind was not bound by structure, but thrived in unpredictability. For a species that had never truly valued individuality, Jack Reeve was a storm they had never seen before. "This human mind," she whispered to herself, tapping one long claw against the glass. Could it turn the tide of the galaxy? From that moment, the human problem was no longer a nuisance. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, and perhaps something far more powerful. The frontier moon of Threxal 4 had once been rich with forests and deep mineral veins, but now it was a graveyard of charred soil and broken sky. Ashes floated through the thin air, and shadows of ruined outposts stretched across the surface like the marks of forgotten battles. It was here that Jack Reeve was sent, at the edge of Zelkari-controlled space, where the Magor hive was, preparing to breach the line. He was given command of a small detachment, a few squads of Zelkari warriors, barely trained in unconventional tactics, and a scattering of outdated equipment. No support, no backup, just a message from the High Command. Hold the line for as long as you can. Everyone believed it was a death sentence, but Jack didn't see it that way. He studied the terrain, examined the patterns of the enemy, and instead of building defenses, he vanished into the broken land with his soldiers. For 3 days, nothing was heard. Then, reports started coming in. Magor scouts were going missing. Patrols vanished. Strange sounds echoed from the canyons. At night, Magor tech began to malfunction. Their bio-beasts turned on their own, and confusion spread among the ranks of the Hive army. Jack had turned the moon into a nightmare. He used every scrap of broken tech to make traps that didn't just kill, but disoriented. He hijacked Magor communication pulses, sending false commands that split their formations. He infected their living weapons with mutated spores he'd discovered in the soil, spores that Jack had realized could trigger panic in the hive mind, and most disturbingly, he used their own dead against them, positioning fallen Magor in chilling displays that shattered their morale. It wasn't just war, it was psychological sabotage on a level the Zelkari had never seen. When the main invasion force finally arrived, they were met with chaos. Entire battalions turned on each other before even seeing an enemy. Jack's team, hidden in the shadows, struck only when it mattered most, using swift, precise attacks to destabilize and vanish again. Within a week, the moon was silent. The Magor had fled, not defeated by overwhelming force, but broken by fear and confusion. For the first time in generations, the hive had retreated. The Zelkari commanders were stunned. They had expected Jack to delay the enemy for a few hours, maybe a day at best. Instead, he delivered total victory against a force 10 times his size. The story spread like fire. Across the Dominion, warriors began training in his methods. Some questioned orders. For the first time, Others designed their own traps, improvised weapons, and broke free of the rigid formations they had known all their lives. The word Reeve style became common in underground training circles. Something ancient was shifting. The hive mind, obedience that had ruled the Zelkari for thousands of years, was beginning to crack, not because of rebellion, but because of inspiration. They had seen a different way, a new kind of power, and it had come from a lone human with no army and no rules. Jack Reeve didn't ask for this. He didn't see himself as a leader of change, only as a man trying to survive and win. But his actions on Threxal 4 had done more than save a moon. They had planted a seed of evolution in a society that had never dared to think differently. And high above, in her palace of crystal and shadow, Queen Zelaria watched the reports flood in. Her claws drummed slowly on the armrest of her throne, and her voice, barely a whisper, echoed through the silent chamber. "What have you done, human?" The galaxy was watching now, and the game was changing. On the towering throne world of the Zelkari, where cities spiraled like hive nests into the sky, and glowing rivers of energy flowed beneath the ground, something old was beginning to crack. The palace halls that once echoed only with the sound of obedience now trembled with whispered arguments, hidden alliances, and ancient fury. Jack Reeve, the human outsider, had become more than a symbol. He had become a spark. His victories, his tactics, and most dangerously, his ideas were spreading like wildfire through the Dominion. Young warriors began to think differently, to question orders, to improvise, and even to speak of a future where individuality could live beside unity. But not everyone welcomed this change. Deep within the Hive Senate, the old guard, those who clung to tradition like it was sacred law, saw Jack's influence as a disease. To them, he was not a strategist, but a threat to their way of life. They whispered in secret chambers, plotted beneath the eyes of the Queen, and slowly began to gather their own forces. Civil fracture loomed like a storm. Jack knew the signs. He saw the way guards looked at him in silence, how messages took longer to reach him, how his Zelkari allies began to disappear or were reassigned. It would have been easy for him to leave, to vanish into the stars with the respect he had earned. But something held him back. Maybe it was the strange loyalty he felt to Queen Zelaria, or perhaps it was because, for the first time in a long while, he believed he could change something bigger than just a battle. When a secret faction of generals moved to assassinate the Queen and seize the throne in the name of tradition, Jack acted, not with brute force, but with the tools only a human could fully master: misdirection, speed, and boldness. He infiltrated the palace chambers with only 3 trusted Zelkari soldiers who had accepted his ways. As the coup began and the traitors moved toward the Queen's chambers, they were met with unexpected explosions that cut off exits, flickering illusions that turned allies against one another, and a blinding flare of smoke in the heart of the throne room. And then, silence. When the smoke cleared, Queen Zelaria stood unharmed, and at her feet lay the defeated traitor commanders, disarmed, disoriented, and staring in disbelief at a human who had outwitted them all. But Jack didn't stop there. He gathered the surviving conspirators and delivered a speech not as a conqueror, but as a soldier. He spoke not of Earth or humanity's past, but of what the Zelkari could become if they embraced change rather than feared it. He didn't beg for peace, he challenged them to earn it. He told them that true strength was not in obeying without question, but in choosing to fight for something worth building. His words, raw and simple, struck deeper than any order could. Queen Zelaria, moved by his actions and understanding the gravity of what he had prevented, rose before the entire court. Her voice rang out across the Dominion. She did not just name Jack Reeve a hero, she named him Strategos Ultima, supreme warlord of the Dominion. A human, once mocked and doubted, now stood at the pinnacle of a star empire's military might. The announcement shook the foundations of Zelkari society. Some bowed in respect, others stood in shock, but no one laughed. The age of mockery was over. Jack had proven that a single human could bend tradition, stop a war before it began, and reshape the destiny of a civilization not with armies, but with will. Far beyond the edges of known space, where stars faded into cold silence, and gravity whispered through ancient debris fields, the final war began. The Magor hive, once thought to be endless in strength and driven by nothing but primal instinct, had rallied for one last strike. Their fleets, black and spined like celestial insects, emerged from the void with unmatched fury, tearing through outposts and breaking lines that had held for centuries. But this time, the Dominion did not face them alone. Under a new banner, the Zell-Human Alliance prepared for war, not as conquerors, but as survivors, defenders, and revolutionaries. At the heart of this alliance stood Jack Reeve, now Strategos. Ultima and Queen Zelaria bonded not just by power, but by vision. Together they commanded fleets designed from both cultures, Zelkari elegance fused with human unpredictability. The Magor adapted quickly, faster than any species had before, but Jack had saved one last plan, one he'd never dared to use until now. He called it the Chaos Protocol. Instead of rigid lines, he scattered the Alliance fleet into hundreds of small, independent strike groups. Every captain was given full autonomy. Confusion reigned. The Magor tried to calculate and control the battlefield, but the swarm couldn't comprehend a war without patterns. They were powerful, but they could not fight what they could not predict. Explosions lit the blackness. Sacrifices were made. Entire crews gave their lives in rogue maneuvers, drawing Magor fleets into ambushes or void storms. Jack led the final push himself, piloting a stealth carrier through the dead zone deep behind enemy lines. His target was the Brain World, the hidden planet where the Magor hive mind pulsed like a great sleeping heart. It was said to be a place of no return, a world covered in nerve towers and living oceans. The suicide strike was never expected to succeed. But Jack had learned to trust not the odds, but the unexpected. He and a hand-picked team landed in silence, moving through the strange, breathing tunnels of the Magor core. What they found shattered every belief the Dominion held. There were no monsters here, only fragile beings clinging to ancient systems. The Brain World was not the heart of a predator, but the last shelter of a dying race. The Magor were not mindless. They were scared, bound to a genetic code they could not change, fighting because it was the only thing they remembered. And, for the first time, Jack did not see enemies. He saw a mirror. He stood before the central neural chamber, placed his weapon on the ground, and offered the Magor a choice: evolve with us, or vanish alone in the dark. It was not an order. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. The hive pulsed, hesitant. Then slowly, it dimmed. Across the galaxy, the war came to a quiet, uneasy end. Fleets stood down, weapons powered off. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of possibility. When Jack returned to the throne world, bruised, exhausted, but alive, Queen Zelaria addressed the entire Dominion and beyond. Her words were broadcast from star to star, carried by light and code to every corner of space. We asked for an army, she said, her voice steady, her gaze proud. He gave us something better. He gave us the future. And so, a human, once alone, once unwanted, became the turning point of empires. Not through domination, but through change. Not with numbers, but with a new way to think. And in the cold silence of space, a new kind of peace began to grow.